So welcome to the first ever official event at the Trade Unions and Communities Hub. So you're part of history today. And I want to introduce Allinson, who has written a book called
Which can we?
And as you know, so when I was thinking about what I wanted to say here today, I think Billy, you started off saying it perfectly, that the best place in Edinburgh for Ian to launch his book is a small chalet, as I call it, in Craigmillar.
Beach hut.
Beach hut. But the importance is what trade unions and community stands for. And in the introduction to Ian's book, you were talking about it already, and it was like resonating with me. It's all about connection, and it's not only about connection in work and organising in work, it's about organising out with work as well, and connecting the different groups and the communities also. Like I think as if we've been at rallies this year, we have seen how, particularly the May Day rally, when we had people talking about all the different issues that are going on in this planet, and there's a lot of them. But the thing at the end of that rally that really struck me, and I think resonates again strongly, is the fact that nothing exists in isolation. Everything is interconnected, and that's why we have to come together as best we can to push back against the things that are happening. And the first line is, there are fundamentally two reasons to organise at work: to change things related to your job, yes, and to change everything else. And that, I think, sums everything up. I think, that sentence, you could have just left it at that. Because if we don't change things at work, and we don't, well, it's a natural place to organise, as you say, because we've got people together. Although we do have challenges as we come out of the pandemic, how work is organised and how we address it. It's the first event, so there's some teething from lungs. So there was, again, even within the first 5 pages of your book, there was things that were just totally jumping out at me. One of the first things was power, and how people, the word power can feel a bit of an icky word, because it's like, well, we have the powerful and we have the powerless, and if we want power, does that make us like them? But there's different forms of power out there, and as you have a brilliant quote from Martin Luther King in the book, that if we want social justice, we need to have power as well. But you can have good power, and you can have, as we can see what's happening just now, when people are in power, bad power as well. And I know that's really simplistic terms to put it in, but I think they are good terms to use rather than overcomplicating the matter as well. The other thing that really struck me is that there is a yawning gap between workers' needs and the feeling of powerlessness that currently dominate the lives of working people. And I think that is really true as well. As much as we've seen lots of people pushing back, there's a lot of workers out there who do not have that resource or that capability, or aren't organised to push back. I work for Lothian Health Branch, and with Derek, my colleague Derek Dickin, and we represent in the social care sector one of the most under union members. Sorry, I'll start again. One of the most, about 4% union membership in the social care sector, and about 200,000 employees in that sector in Scotland, and some of the most heinous employers that you could come across. And trying to organise in that sector is so challenging. I see employers actively discouraging people to join the union, or not even discouraging them, frightening them, that if you join the union, you might not have a job going forward. And that's no stuff that happened years ago, that is stuff that is actually going on now. So again, this book could not have come along at a more pertinent time. The other thing that I thought was really, really important about this is, because I completely identified with this when I first started to become active within the movement. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm always looking for books and information, and I would be on Amazon, sorry, I do use Amazon, looking for a book about trade unions and about how to organise. But as you say in your, the introduction, Ian, there are a lot of good books out there, but a lot of them are not maybe starting at a more basic level, particularly if you're new to the movement, and it can feel a bit scary when you're reading about things and you're like, I don't quite understand, how do you organise, how do you do this, how do you do that? And I think, this is a handbook for doing that. And things like, you know, we have become, I would say, as a caseworker working for a branch, we have become very focused on casework, and I wouldn't disagree with that at all. And I'd be really interested to hear later on how we can use that to actually organise as well, particularly in areas where it is very challenging to organise. Sometimes it's challenging to even get into the door to represent someone as well. So yeah, so I'm going to hand you over to Ian before I whitter on any more, but I just think this book could not have come along at a better time and could not be launched in a better venue than the trade unions in the community. So welcome, Ian.
It's great to see everyone. Fantastic to be here. What an amazing project to get a place like this up and running. So Pete's going to be my glamorous assistant with the slides. So thanks very much, Pete. If you could just move on. Yeah. So what I'm going to try and talk about is a little bit of an introduction about myself, why I wrote the book, very quick overview of what the book covers, and then I'm going to pick out 3 of the things I discuss in the book, just to kind of get some discussion going, and then wrap up with some stuff about what's planned next. Thanks, Pete. So I'm Manchester based. I've been a workplace activist for a very long time, mainly in the private sector, in a largely ununionised sector, actually with a lower union membership than social care, which is quite an achievement. And while there, I managed to organise a number of strikes, including the first national strike in the IT industry in Britain. I've been involved at kind of all levels within my union, which was mainly what's now Unite, including 10 years on the executive of Unite, and I also stood for General Secretary 5 years ago. I didn't win, oddly enough, but I did get a few votes. Currently, one of my main roles is Manchester Trades Council, which is like the umbrella group for trade unions in the city. I'm on the executive of that, where my main role is organising solidarity with disputes, which has got kind of busy over the last Anyway, moving on. Why I wrote the book, I'd sum it up in one word as frustration. So all that time as an activist, I found myself learning from all over the place. I learned from training courses, I learned from people I met, I learned from things I read, from events. But over and over again, I found myself thinking, I wish somebody had told me that 5 years ago. That could have saved me a lot of pain. And there's frustration that there wasn't the kind of book I wanted to read about how to go about organising work. There are lots of, you know, as Lynn mentioned, there are lots of good books out there, but I found they tended to suffer from 2 problems. The first is a lot of them either just talk about the kind of nuts and bolts of how to have an organising conversational map for your workplace, or they present a kind of grand plan for how to revitalise the global working class movement. And I think if you're trying to organise at work, you need something that's a bit more in between, that's got a lot of the technique, but also has some of the politics and the ideas. Because to me, they don't make any sense apart. You know, how can you go about organising effectively if you're not clear why you're doing it, you know, what you're trying to achieve, and so on. The second problem was that a lot of us were relying very heavily on books from America, and there's some great books from America. So Jane McAlevy's stuff has become very widely used over the last few years. There's also some brilliant books from Labour Notes, which is a kind of rank and file network based in the US. But obviously the US and Britain aren't the same. You know, the terrain's different, you know, legally, industrially, politically, culturally, you name it, it's not the same. So there's a lot of kind of work when you read these things and trying to work out, well, does that apply here? If it does apply here, how do I adapt it for conditions here? So there's that kind of thing. But also there's whole chunks missing, because you do need to understand the terrain you're fighting on. And obviously a book written by somebody in the US isn't going to explain the terrain we're fighting on here in Britain. So that was kind of my personal drive for writing the book, was that frustration. The other side of it, though, is it seemed to me there were a lot of people who wanted to organise at work, but who were struggling to access the guidance and support on how to do it. And the most obvious example of that, I think, is I got loads out of training courses put on by my union, but for the most part, you have to be a rep in order to get on those training courses. And if you're not in a unionised workplace, you're not going to be a rep, and you're not going to get access to the course. So the people who most need the help and support to unionise their workplace are denied access to the, you know, the widest, most available resources. So in my head, I thought there were 3 groups of you kind of divide it down to who are wanting to organise at work. I'm sure there's others, but firstly, just workers who are fed up with how they're being treated. That's probably the biggest group, and obviously that's increased a lot over the last couple of years with the cost of living crisis and the inspiration of the strikes. Secondly, I thought there was a layer of people who'd been inspired by Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party who felt really let down by what had come since. And I recognise the political terrain in Scotland is a little bit different to what it is where I am in Manchester, but I suspect there's a similar dynamic in some ways, that people who'd put their hopes in a kind of electoral project then thinking, well, actually, no, we're going to have to do things for ourselves if we want to get change. And thirdly, and quite excitingly, I think, there's people from a number of social movements who've been increasingly recognising the importance of organising at work to bring about other changes in society. And I particularly single out the climate movement in that. And obviously, for many years, it's been quite common to see unions and environmentalists kind of at loggerheads a lot of the time. We've had unions backing environmentally destructive projects. We've often had environmentalists treating workers in polluting industries as if they're the enemy rather than potential allies. And it's been great to see that starting to break down a little bit, you know, seeing Extinction Rebellion doing solidarity with 4 oil refinery workers recently, you know, just brilliant to see that. Some of the workers who would have been, I think, not so long ago treated as the problem rather than a potential solution. So I think there's quite a few people from environmental movements or the social movements seeing the importance of organising at work, but again, not necessarily really knowing where to start. So in terms of what the book covers, there's a few chapters at the start, but the main body of the book, chapters 3 through to 9, are trying to follow the journey of an imaginary activist from starting out trying to organise at work, trying to do basic things like getting people talking and not getting fired and things like that, gathering information about your employer, through to hopefully in chapter 9 managing to organise some industrial and direct action and win some big stuff. So it's trying to follow through that kind of journey. And then at the end I've got 3 chapters that are dealing with some of the problems you might face any point along the way. So some of the things management get up to try and wreck your organising efforts. Some of the things about dealing with your own union. I think a lot of people, if they first start trying to organise, have a view of unions that maybe comes from the BBC or the Daily Mail, and they imagine that they'll be being pushed into going on strike, you know, much sooner than they want, and then they start organising and they find actually trying to get things to happen can be quite challenging. And some of the people they expect to be supporting them are sometimes not as helpful as they might be, and sometimes are downright obstructive. Part of what I think, and this is why I'll cover this a little bit today, is I think it's really useful for anyone trying to organise to have their eyes open a little bit to that stuff so that we can try and navigate it. Because I think the worst thing is for people to go in with expectations like this and then have them dashed and not understand why. And that's how people become demoralised and give up and think this isn't worth doing. And then finally, just some of the more general problems we can have with organising campaigns and some of the limitations of trade unionism. So I'll move on. What is organising? I put this slide in because it's one of these words that gets bandied around to mean lots of different things, a bit like socialism or Christianity. It means whatever you want it to mean. So you hear people talking about organising and they mean, sometimes they just mean getting workers to fill in a direct debit form to join a union. That's really not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about systematically trying to build workers' power, and by power I mean our ability to collectively win the stuff we want, even when people try and stop us. That's what I mean by power. So, just to emphasise, I am not primarily talking about union membership. So I'm sure you all know examples of workplaces where there's some people in the union, but they don't stick together. You know, they get trampled all over by management because they don't stick together. And equally, and much more positively, we have examples of workplaces where people aren't in unions, but they do stick together. So if people saw the amazing action by Allinson workers in the warehouses where they did the sit-ins in the canteens a few months ago, or down the road from me in Bury, there's the Cranswick Continental Foods Factory, which is one of these workplaces, if you were trying to do a stereotype of like, oh, you won't be able to organise there, it would be a factory like this. It's got 50 nationalities, loads of different languages, high labour turnover, shifts, you name every barrier to organising, they've got it. And yet they managed to pull off a strike for 2 or 3 days and win some concessions. And when I went up there to talk to some of the workers who'd been on strike didn't know what a union was. but they knew what strike was. And to my mind, that is much more about organising than the people who filled in a direct debit form that don't stick together. So I'm labouring the point perhaps slightly, but hopefully you get what I'm driving at. So it's all about workers' own collective action. It's not about anybody rescuing us. It's not about the union rescuing us, or a lawyer rescuing us, or the media, or a celebrity, or whoever kind of coming and sorting our problems out for us. It's about us sticking together. So it's all about participation, building organisation, building capacity, and so on. So we can move on. So as I mentioned, I think we need some of the ideas and some of the technique in order to be effective. And because this is trying to provoke a discussion rather than be a training course, I'm going to focus today on some of the ideas rather than the technique. So what are some of the key ideas? I think the first is a commitment to that approach, that workers are advancing their interests through their own collective action, not any of the kind of shortcuts or charity work or whatever. It's about helping workers stick together. I think for that to be successful, you have to have a degree of belief that workers generally make wise choices when there's important issues there and when there's a credible way forward on offer. This isn't about having a rose-tinted view. I'm sure we've all worked with some complete idiots who've done some really stupid things. But when the important stuff comes up, I think most of the time people are pretty sensible. And I think that's reflected in the massive strike votes we're seeing at the moment, because you have to be pretty naive to imagine you can fix the cost of living crisis on your own. It's fairly obvious we're only going to be able to tackle that collectively, and I think that's that comes through. I'm struggling to read with the bright lights, but yeah, it's some of the things I'm going to cover in a moment. Understanding of power. I don't think we get workers talking about that enough, and an understanding of unions and their limitations. So that's why I'm picking out those areas to talk about today. Yeah, if we could move on. So on power, in the book I use a model of power that's adapted from a great book by Beverly Silver called Forces of Labour. And what I argue is that there are different groups of workers have different amounts of different types of potential power. So here I've got a few examples. So structural power, which comes from your position in the production process or in the overall economy. So an obvious example, we've recently had dock strikes in Felixstowe and Liverpool, and relatively small numbers of workers, a few thousand workers involved, but they handle the majority of Britain's container traffic. So clearly they have potential power across the whole economy way beyond their numbers. But there are lots of other examples as well. How many people here have seen the film Made in Dagenham? A few. So it's a brilliant film about the Ford's Dagenham sewing machinist strike for equal pay. And this was just a group of workers who made the seat covers for cars. And when they stopped work, Ford stopped, because you can't sell cars without seat covers. So by taking one group of workers out, they had a massive disproportionate impact in the whole process. That's another example. Another one that perhaps people talk about less, but I think it's been revealed by the pandemic. So if you think about primary school teachers, who are not generally seen as the most powerful group of workers, but when kids aren't in school, half the rest of the workforce is at home looking after their kids, right? So there's a potential ripple effect because of their role across the rest of society. So that's structural power. We could talk about market power, which is about your position in the labour market. So how easy are you to replace? Have you got some kind of niche skills that are in short supply? That makes you more powerful in relation to your employer in terms of their readiness to fire you or their ease of replacing you or whatever. But it's also about how well you can survive without your wages. So if you're having to take action, have you got a strong community? Have you got savings? Have you got an allotment? Have you got a generous welfare benefits system that can support you? We can dream, can't we? But those kind of things clearly have an effect on power. And I think that's an example of what Lynn was talking about the relationship between organising at work and in wider society. Because every time there's an attack on benefits, people think of that primarily as about the state trying to save money and off the poorest people in society. But actually one of its key roles is to intensify competition for the lowest paid jobs. So it's about attacking workers in work when they cut benefits for people who are out of work as well as those in work, many of whom are claiming them as well. We could talk about some other sorts of power. I appreciate you're probably having as much difficulty reading this as I am with the sunshine, which is lovely. But associational power is about organisations. That's not just about unions, but it's about Community organisations, political parties, campaigns and so on, and those clearly are a big help. We could talk about institutional power, things like legal enforcement, or if employers have signed up to ethical codes of practice and things like that, that can be a form of leverage as well. But all of these are examples of potential power. And I think it's really important to recognise there's a difference between potential power and actual power. And what are the missing ingredients? Before we had our first national strike, I organised a training course for the reps and the company I was working for. And we had a guest speaker who was the convener from the Craigmillar oil refinery, not so far from here. And they'd recently had a dispute about a similar issue, and he was talking about that. And he was saying, well, it was easy for us. We had an oil refinery to play with. And everybody giggled a little bit, but people knew exactly what he meant, that their power was obvious, was in them. But there was an example that came out in the discussion that I found really, really useful, which was people were talking about supermarket checkout staff who are generally treated very badly and seen bottom of the pile in terms of jobs. But if you think about it, they've got millions of pounds of perishable goods going across the tills every day, and if they don't sell them, what's going to happen? Some of them will rot, some of them will melt. But people generally are going to go and do the shopping somewhere else. So there's potential power there, isn't there, from the role they're doing. But if you think about how the work's organised, if I stop working on my till and you carry on yours and you carry on yours, nobody notices. Because the work's organised in parallel, it's kind of the opposite of the sewing machinist strike, isn't it? We all have to stop together. We need more organisation. We need more associational power because we have less of the structural power. We still have potential power, but we have to use it in different ways. So what are those missing ingredients then to turn that potential power into actual power? Why is it that those checkout staff are treated so badly? And I think the first thing is awareness. I don't think most workers think about what potential power they've got and discuss it, and I think we should try and get workers doing that a lot more. So if supermarket checkout staff thought about, particularly this time of year, how much money their boss would lose if they stopped the tills, that's a good discussion to be having. The second is organisation. Without organisation, you can't wield that potential power. And then the third element for turning potential power into actual power is about the kind of political will, because there's a disease affecting trade unions, which is called partnership, which is the idea that we have a shared interest with our employers, that the best way to advance workers' interests is to make sure our boss is fantastically successful, and some of that will kind of trickle down to the rest of us. And if you buy into that, and I'm mocking it, but it's incredibly widespread in the unions to a greater or lesser extent, if you buy into that, you can't fight, because you're more afraid of hurting your boss than you are of getting hurt yourself. So there's an ideological element as well. And down at the bottom here, which you probably can't see, I think it's the last of these I've got as an example of a type of power, is ideological power. And if you think about how much effort employers and the press and government put into trying to persuade us it would be wrong for us to fight back, that we would be causing inflation if we got a pay rise that was only a bit less than inflation rather than a lot less than inflation, or that we would be endangering the health service that they've been busy cutting and dismantling for years if health workers take action and so on. So they put a lot of effort into trying to persuade us that it would be wrong for us to take action. And there's a reason for that, which is that workers tend to only be willing in numbers to take action when they believe it's the right thing to do. Right? So it matters what ideas are knocking around in a workforce, whether we have the kind of ideological capacity to resist that right-wing nonsense that's being thrown at us to blame us for everything. So that matters too. So if we could move on, please, Pete. So a little bit on unions and their limitations. So I'm sorry, I'm struggling to read my own slide here. I've argued that union membership isn't the core of organising, but it is essential in my view, because though it's true that you can organise collective action, in one or two workplaces, or sometimes on a slightly wider scale without any organisation, if you want to be able to sustain the capacity to have collective action across a large group of workers or over an extended period of time, you need some sort of permanent organisation, hopefully with some democracy and so on, so that you can keep it under control. So I think unions are essential if we want to be able to do this well, even though that's not the central task. But there's problems with unions. A lot of them adopt that partnership approach I was talking about to a greater or lesser extent. A lot of them adopt what I call an individualised servicing approach, which is what Lynn was talking about a little bit with some of the way casework is handled, where unions act like their job is to kind of rescue individual members, like an insurance policy, call us when you're in trouble and we'll get you out of trouble, that kind of thing. And that doesn't build power, ultimately, if that's the approach, we take. I argue that unions are inherently sectional, and what I mean by that is that they represent only parts of the working class. So most obviously, they tend to only organise in one or two countries, not the whole world's working class. But there are other examples, aren't there? We can think about the history of unions when they fought to exclude women and black people from certain industries and occupations, or we could think today the unions that campaign for fracking because they think it's in the interests of one section of their existing membership, even if it's clearly against the interests of the working class as a whole. So that's a problem that I think is really widespread with unions. They often accept a kind of division of labour where they outsource political issues or issues they declare are political to the Labour Party in particular in England. But they say, you get people at the top of unions who kind of wash their hands of what they see as political issues, and that weakens us when that happens. But it also lets the people at the top of the political parties off the hook. So we get people like Starmer, refusing to support picket lines and so on, and support strikes. So that's really unhelpful to accept that division of labour. Fundamentally, when we're working through unions, we are negotiating the terms of our own exploitation and oppression, aren't we? So it's accepting that old boss-worker framework. It's just trying to make it a bit less awful, but it's not fundamentally challenging it. So that's quite a fundamental limitation of unions. And because unions, once they develop any sort of scale, require a kind of apparatus, they have buildings and bank accounts and paid staff and all this kind of thing, they develop institutional interests that aren't the same as those of members. So, and this particularly is an issue for those who are paid officers of unions, who come under a lot of pressure to prioritise the protection of the union as an institution, whereas for most workers, the union is a means to an end, isn't it? It's a way of trying to get more job security or protect standard of living or whatever. So you get conflicts within unions for all these reasons. Unions themselves are a site of struggle between paid officers and members, between left and right, different factions, people employed by different employers or in different industries. So I think it's really important when people are organising that people have their eyes open to those kind of issues. Good. Move on, please. So this is my last slide. You'll be relieved to hear. Oops. You've got another pop-up that's appeared. So it's about next steps, anyway, if I remember correctly. What the next slide is. Yeah, phew, that's really. Just as organising is a collective effort, so is working out how to do it well. And I explained where I got my ideas from. It's like everybody else, pretty much everything in the book I've nicked from someone else over the years. And that process of trying to work out how to organise well isn't going to stop just because some idiot wrote a book. So I'm really keen that when people read it, you're going to read something and you're going to think, oh, he's missed out that, which I found really useful, or that didn't work for me, or that worked but I had to do it in a different way because I'm in a different context. So I think it'd be really useful if people sent in those experiences, or for that matter, the things you did find really useful, and I can stick them on the website that I've created to go with the book. The second reason I've made the website is that the terrain we're fighting on keeps changing. And I don't want people picking up the book in 6 months or a year and getting some out-of-date or wrong advice. So, for example, we know the Tories are trying to push through yet more anti-worker, anti-strike, anti-union legislation. Workers need to understand what the legislative framework is in order to either navigate it or break it, or whatever it is that people decide to do. So I want to make sure that people have the right information. So I'll be posting updates on the website as the terrain changes. So I've created a mailing list that goes with the website, and I'd encourage people, there's a sign-up sheet on here. People can pop their email address and details down on there, and you'll get updates when there are key things go up on the website. If you do, it's vital you tick the GDPR opt-in column, which is the data protection thing. If you don't put a yes or a tick in there, I can't email you. So I did notice one person had signed up to it earlier and not ticked that. So if you don't tick it, I can't email you. So please do just go back and put a little tick on it if you want to ever hear from me again. I've been doing a tour of events like this around the country. I think we're getting up towards 30 events I've done now all over the country, to try to get the book into the hands of the workers who need it, because I think there's a problem that there's a kind of a milieu of people who are already engaged around unions, and I think many of those will benefit from the book as well. It's not just aimed at people who are new to organising. Everybody would learn something from it. But I do think it's also important it gets into the hands of people who are trying to organise from scratch and maybe not plugged into those kind of activist networks. So that's part of what I'm trying to do. And a lot of people are helping with that. I mean, it's been great getting invitations to places like this, events like this. There's union branches that have been doing bulk orders to put them out to all their reps, for example, which I think is really exciting. There's a number of places, and I know there's similar plans here, where people are doing reading groups around the book, and I think that's a brilliant idea. I mean, firstly, because not everyone's a great reader, so just being able to talk it through with people can be a big help to some people. But for everybody, I think you get more out of reading something if you can discuss it and have a bit of space to think through how that might or might not work for you. So I've put some discussion questions at the end of every chapter, which you could use for a discussion group or a reading group if you wanted to. Obviously, you can just make up your own or talk about whatever you want if you're doing that. So yeah, I'll leave it there, and let's have some discussion about your own experiences and questions and thoughts.